Welcome to Healing, Gift of Love, episode 9.1, Thursday the 4th of March, 2021. This is the prelude to the first movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony conducted by Leonard Bernstein, celebrating the reunification of Germany and Berlin and the tearing down of the wall. Today we're going to read from another Robert Ingraham article. It is a 35-page contribution to defending the unfinished work of the American Revolution, which is a Renaissance project, an apostolic Christian project, a Torah-based Judaism project, a Platonist, and Plato and the Academy would have looked favorably upon this project, so I believe. It's a project related to what Akhenaten did when he tried to reform radically the religion and culture of decadent late Egypt and make it monotheistic and build a new capital city and begin to reform and perhaps eliminate the power of certain corrupt oligarchical families and probably priests that had children in the mix. So oligarchical priesthood dynasties, and they would be potentially using religion for mind control purposes, for manipulation, and simply as a money-making, power-holding operation, and that it needed to be reformed is almost beside the point. Egypt had seemingly, it's a mystery, it seems to have started at a high point and then declined ever since. There are pictures, there are carvings on these bas-reliefs in the walls, and they show the carving or the painting something that looks like a huge light bulb lighting up the innards of the Great Pyramid complex in the hallways. And you have to ask yourself, if there's no evidence that torches were used that were on fire, like lit oil or some kind of other enhanced material, if there's no evidence of that, how did they see in those passageways? And there is on the show, Gaia Television, the mystery show that's been appropriated by a popular YouTuber who does compilations of this sort of thing, and she's compiled the evidence that the underground tunnels under the Great Pyramid were used in a way to create a resonance field with the piezoelectric effect, and somehow there's a case to be made that electricity was generated. I'm not sure I entirely understand it, but it's an interesting thing to imagine that perhaps it was a very advanced, technologically advanced as well, complex. And so the culture would have degenerated, and the more generations you are removed from the builders of your culture and civilization, the further you are into potential decline, because you don't understand what it is that was done to build it. You don't understand how to maintain it as a result. And if it begins to fail, you may not have the ability to renew it on an emergency basis. So If you just think about it, if we are gathering in North America and in the 1760s, or even when we first came over colonists, aren't we coming over to support ourselves? We're not coming over here to set up a slave-based system and have vast plantations and slaves working them. You could possibly dream that way in a wicked, very wicked way. If you were one of the first into Jamaica or Barbados, but you'd have to kind of have a joy in taking things away from people. It's quite a theft to take them out of their milieu, their family, their networks, their familiarity with life itself. It's just you get yanked out of someplace in Africa and now you're in a little island where things look different and you don't even know the language. And now you may be separated from your wife and your children. That's pretty sick. Even if you thought that these beings were somehow inferior, it's still pretty sick because you know that they're not completely less than human. You know that they're human, but many of them, I'm sure, the white dealers and slaves felt that the whites were superior and that somehow it wasn't quite as bad because of that. I don't know about that, and okay, so it's History Channel, Pyramid Power Plants, Season 12, Episode 7 from 2 years ago. That's one, how the pyramids were built and things like that. Electricity 4,500 years ago. Ancient Egyptian electricity inside the Great Pyramid of Giza. So what you need to do is you get curious about that subject, you go in and find the sections of Ancient Aliens or the History Channel or Gaia Television that deal with how the water being pumped through very smaller and smaller channels, so they created very high pressure, could create a resonant wave, and there's this the theory that there was electricity created somehow through the piezoelectric effect impulsing this water in a certain way. Let's begin the reading. This is a reading dedicated, as is this music, this is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which is the music of the American Revolution and the innovation in terms of the classical symphony of adding a choral based on Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy in the fourth movement. And it's a celebration of freedom, independence for everyone, for all. And America's unfinished mission, as I see it, as I would have it, as I wish it would be, and wish it would return to, is to bring peace and harmony and the brotherhood and sisterhood of all mankind, of all womankind, of all of humanity and all sentient beings, to harmonize these things to the best of our abilities, but to do so as a community of sovereign nation states committed to universal moral principle of doing good for the other as we also seek to do good for ourselves, to do good for its own sake, to seek to make plans to preserve ecology to preserve the oceans, to have clean water available for all human beings, to have a basic level of electricity, clean water, sanitation in terms of sewage, and basic infrastructure, education, with choice. There should never be one system of schooling, like in a communist regime, where there is no dissident school allowed. There's no school where you can go easily now for a conservative liberal arts education, but there are schools. You can go to Hillsdale College, or you can opt out of a conventional track and go to St. John's and study the great books, and you can go to other smaller. There's many small conservative colleges, but the way conservatism was, like into the 60s and 70s, like Washington and Lee University, where I had some friends, and my biological father went to law school, was very conservative. It's no longer the case. It's like the difference between the National Review and the Epoch Times. The Epoch Times is actually a pretty good newspaper in some regard. Not in every regard, but it does have a lot of interesting overview that is missing. You'll never find it in the Washington Post or the New York Times, or be introduced to this way of thinking of things. And it's a traditional, universal morality associated and coming from Christianity, but also related to what comes from a proper understanding of Confucian morality, which is very similar to the Sermon on the Mount. Do not do to others which you would not want them to not do to you. Okay, Manhattan's struggle for human freedom against the slave power of Virginia. I'll go for half an hour total this episode, and then we'll pick it up. It's a long article. It's the best article I think he's ever written, because it provides a discovery to most readers. It certainly surprised me. I didn't realize how close we were to a leadership in the early days of the Revolution, after the Articles of Confederation and before the Constitution was a project that could be done, while Hamilton is still trying to figure out what to do to strengthen the central government so that the young and vulnerable colonies could defend themselves against the machinations of the empire, which had so reluctantly given up these possessions. Well, Manhattan's struggle for human freedom is the story of 4 Columbia College, then it was King's College, graduates: Gouverneur Morris, Robert Livingston, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton, who was the last, the youngest, and the most incredible American that ever lived. When we speak of who should have been vice president and vice president, we look back in the aftermath. Who should have been chosen, given the viciousness by which John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were murdered? Did we really want it to be Richard Nixon? Because there was a movement to create a healing through civil rights that then became more universal when Martin Luther King began to speak out against the Vietnam War. And you had figures like Cassius Clay become Muhammad Ali and take a stand. And at the time, I believe many conservative white Americans, many male working and middle class men, Saul the Black turned to Islam, and the rejection of the Vietnam War as illegitimate, as some sort of communist instigated insurrectionary movement that was quite dangerous. But if you think about it, we accomplished nothing as a nation in Vietnam, and we did an incredible amount of damage, and the war machine got its chance to practice. We ruined lives. We murdered people. We murdered our own people. They were mutilated. We murdered those people, and they were mutilated. This battle for freedom, for human freedom against the slave power. Well, what do you think is the kind of power that can draft you? It's 1968. Suppose it's 1968. You're a black man in the ghetto, and you're 18 years old, and your draft notice and tells you that the gig is up. You've got to go to Vietnam. You have no choice. Now, unless you can come up with a medical excuse or shoot yourself in the foot, you're going, unless you go to Canada. What kind of power would require that of its supposed citizenry? That's not volunteering based upon consent. That's a standing army that is there in service to itself, to the purposes of the oligarchy. And the American Revolution was specifically anti-monarchy when monarchy had become a tyranny, and which it usually does. But it may not always be a tyranny. It may be benevolent. There have been benevolent monarchs, such as Alexander II, who sent his navy as a show of force to New York Harbor in 1863, 1864, and to San Francisco Harbor as a show of force against the British, and also the Spanish and the French, to say that if they intervened in support of the Confederacy, the British intervened. The Tsar of Russia had standing orders given to his Navy commanders in the New York Harbor with his small fleet in San Francisco as well, to intervene immediately on behalf of Mr. Lincoln and Tsar Alexander II, who had emancipated his serfs and reformed the system of serfdom. It's not quite slavery, but it's not much further up on the ladder of freedom. And in 1861, he had emancipated the serfs and begun a massive reform effort. Bravo. Well, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln was talked into it by Cassius Marcellus Clay, the namesake of Muhammad Ali, who was Cassius Clay. Cassius Marcellus Clay was a Kentucky abolitionist who was ambassador to Russia and helped arrange the support for Mr. Lincoln. And he was also the one that insisted that Lincoln eliminate slavery in the Confederate areas that were taken by the Union. Once they were controlled by the Union Army, that slavery be on an emergency, like martial law basis, be immediately eradicated, and the slaves be brought to safety. In other words, it's for their safety, and it's to break the back of the support for the Confederacy, because we don't want slave owners to have a lot of resources garnered by their slave labor to support the war. And why don't we want the war? Is this really a war that's only about economics? Primarily economics? Well, you could say it's economics, but it's really an issue of, can a free republic, a sovereign republic, proclaim itself as the temple of hope, the last best refuge of mankind? Temple of Liberty, Beacon of Hope, City on a Hill, John Winthrop's City on a Hill. Are we able to proclaim ourselves as such, knowing full well that we were and still are a slave-based society? There are classes of financier oligarchs, small groups of them, that believe the earth is overpopulated and that it should be reduced population down to 3 to 2 to 1 billion, perhaps 500 million, like on the Georgia Guidestones on Stone Mountain. And say that 500 million is the limit. Well, if they believe that, and they believe that they can have these transhumanist fantasy, incredibly long lifespans, but only for themselves, not for the masses, I think that we're talking about a breakaway branch of the human race that thinks it's superior and owes nothing to the rest of us that they would seek to leave behind. And I think that's dangerous, and that's on top of the Marxist socialist aspect of the Fabian socialist plans for a one-world government, on top of a one-world economic system. There's also the plan for a one-world religion. And the problem is when you disallow dissent, it has very unhappy results. You need to allow free speech and dissent and contrary points of view. And even if you're like a Christian nation, you need to allow the atheists to be atheists. Let them be. Let the Jews be Jews. They don't have to be Christians. Let the Muslims be Muslims until they decide that they're tired of being Muslims. Let the Hindus be Hindus unless they want to change. Unless and until they want to change. So you tolerate all the differences. You just disallow anybody from imposing their will and causing unhappiness with their opinions, turning them into policy and imposing them against the will of others and causing unnecessary suffering. So this question of slavery, can a society that is claiming to be so wonderful, could it have had any slavery whatsoever? Well, yes, it might have, because there were European indentured servants, Irish indentured servants. There was white slavery in Europe throughout the Middle Ages. The Turks like to have white slaves, and in general, slavery is just wrong, and it'd be most unwelcome if it was imposed on any one of us. I mean, it's just not that hard to figure out. Like, even if you think you're so superior, are you really so superior that you're going to treat somebody like an animal, like a pet that you buy at the pet shop, and you feed them and then they do things for you? And is that really how you're going to treat another human being? Separate them from any kind of free reign? So here we go. Manhattan's struggle for human freedom against the slave power of Virginia, from the May 8, 2015 issue of Lyndon LaRouche's and his associates' publication, Executive Intelligence Review, a contribution to an ongoing discussion. There are myths and counter-myths surrounding the early history of the United States of America. It is often difficult for the mere observer to discern what was actually going on and what the nature of the battle was. This document will demonstrate that from the very beginning, this nation was defined by a titanic war between two opposing forces, opponents who differed not merely on practical political issues, but on the very nature of the human species itself. On the one side was the New York leadership, who created the U.S. Constitution and defined the mission of the United States during the presidency of George Washington. Against them were arrayed the Virginiacombine of the Southern slave power, an anti-human aristocracy, really an anti-human oligarchy. The original use of the word aristos was to mean the best. And the rule of the best was the rule of the aristos, which meant that the best were ruling for the benefit of everyone concerned. It was all part of the package of the party, of the faction, of the leadership group that believed in doing good for its own sake, and they were the party of the good, true, and beautiful. And they weren't doing it for power and money. Or so they said. Now, for the cynics, they would just say, well, that's just another ruse. It's always about the power and the money, and there's no escaping that. But there are obviously gentler ways to be ruled, and you can give your consent to be ruled by a gentle ruler and quite enjoy things. But if you can't even practice your religion, and you're herded into a camp and sterilized, and your women are raped by Han Chinese, and some of your friends are they're shot and their organs are harvested. So you think, you're not even sure. That's pretty sick. And that's what they're doing in the People's Republic of China, and they did it to Tibet, and they may be doing it to the Hong Kong activists who stood up to them, and they may do it in Taiwan. And if we don't stop them, they may be coming here within the next 10 or 20 years. On the one side of the battle, from the very beginning, was the New York leadership who created the U.S. Constitution and defined the mission of the United States during the presidency of George Washington. Against them, they combined the slave interest, the Southern slave power that was primarily led by Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and then James Monroe. And that string of presidents from George Washington to Abraham Lincoln does not include any more than 3 anti-slavery presidents. George Washington, who at the end, he became quietly anti-slavery in terms of his own personal property. John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams. Every other president was unwilling to stand up to it. And the tone had been set by the formation of Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. So that's how we got the American Civil War, is that slavery wasn't phased out. There was a celebration, as we read yesterday, January 1st, 1808, when they began to celebrate